Hello, my name's Troy Murphy, and I want to welcome you to Walk in My Shoes. You might be asking yourself, why? Why should we walk in other people's shoes? Researchers say that if we spend a little bit of time understanding each other's story, it actually eliminates so much tension and conflict. It actually is a way of problem solving. What I want to challenge you in the next 5 weeks is to sit in a room with some people of diversity. You may not have diversity as great as you'd like where you're at and where you're listening, but I would challenge you, even between genders, even between ages, to find someone of diversity and to pull a chair up and to hear their story. Stories are amazing. I remember when I sat down with my grandma before she passed and listened to her stories and listened to where she came from as her family had immigrated from France and was in New York, and my great-great-great-grandfather was a police chief in New York City, and then moving to Hollywood to be a movie studio's police security person, which was just amazing. My grandmother telling me she was a Rosie the Riveter, slid into the wings of an airplane to put on rivets. You see, when we understand someone's story, it starts to help us maybe learn to empathize and maybe understand the pain. We can't be another person, but we can spend some time sitting in their shoes. This first section that we're going to talk about today is with a great guest, and I want to model understanding their story, but we're going to talk about being aware, made aware of the unique American history as it deals with race and diversity. And I want to encourage you as we to focus on the African American history here in America. What was Black history like? What are the ramifications of that? How has that affected us? Sit back, find someone that's different than you in the room, and watch as we meet our guest and we walk in their shoes. Hey friends, welcome to Walk in My Shoes. This is our very first guest. Pretty excited to introduce to you today Dr. Adam Green. Let me just give you a little bit of background on who he is and what he's accomplished. He's the Associate Professor of American History in the College at the University of Chicago, faculty affiliate, the Center of the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, faculty board member for the Karla Scherer Center of the Study of American Culture, senior fellow, Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts, a PhD from Yale University. He's got publications, quite an extensive list of things he's accomplished. And probably the last one I'll just say, he's the son of Ernest Green, which we're going to find out soon. I want to introduce to you Dr. Adam Green. Adam, so good to have you with us today and just sharing with us about Black history in America.
It's great to be here, Troy, and thanks so much for the opportunity to talk with you and your audience.
Well, why don't we get started? And I introduced you as the son of Ernest Green. And for myself, in just meeting you and learning about who that is and who you are, why don't you give our listeners really some, I guess, cultural and historical background on that story?
Well, let me start with a personal anecdote, which was that I can remember really, in some ways, one of the first times that I ever encountered a book of history or a book portraying history. I think it's one of these picture books that, Life magazine or some other publication would put together. And it was, I think, about the 60s. And I think I was 5 or 6 at the time when I saw the book. And in the book was a picture of my father graduating from Central High School.
Wow.
Which was a news photograph. And in fact, it turned out that at his graduation, he didn't know this, I think, until the day of his graduation, Martin Luther King came up from Montgomery, Alabama. He wasn't, the Martin Luther King of the 1960s, but he was very interested in affirming and supporting the young people that were at the center of the struggle in Little Rock High School. So he was there at his graduation. There were photographers from Life magazine, so on and so forth. But for me, at the age of 4 or 5 or 6, I guess a couple of things, were brought home to me. One was that my father, who I loved and I had a close relationship with, still do today, he belonged to other people besides me. There were other people that were interested in him. There were other people that wanted to learn his story and tell his story. And so I needed, in one sense, to share, which is difficult sometimes when you're that age and trying to think about your parents and your family members. But also people were curious about his story. There was something that captivated them about that story. And it kind of brought me to a greater curiosity about knowing his place in history. And then from that, knowing the place of other people and other events, and taking seriously that, those stories are shared among all of us and there are ways to communicate. And then I think the second thing, and I didn't fully understand this as a kid, but I worked hard over the course of my life. And I suppose in some ways my work has partly been an attempt to answer this question, is that people were interested in his story because they thought that he had changed things. And knowing that somebody who walks and talks alongside you is someone who can be seen to have changed things means that you appreciate more the possibilities of change more generally within society, that people can make change by just staying the course and going to school.
You're speaking of the event called the Little Rock Nine, which I was not aware of, and I find it some divine irony in the fact that your father was a part of some activism, and now you are a person who does not just research, but are a part of talking a different way about activism and how change needs to happen. And so I think as we start with this walk in my shoes, it's important that we're made aware of some of the historical context for Black Americans. And that's very unique. And as we talked earlier, Adam, that there's European Black history, there's the African continent of Black history. That's all over for many different ethnicities. But specific to Black American history, could you just paint for our listeners what's unique about that? And what are some of the baggages that we're carrying, or maybe some of the assumptions, or even we're a little bit ignorant of the realities that would affect a generation after generation of Black Americans?
I think the first thing that's important to think about with this is that past events can consequentially shape your present reality. And, if we don't do things, they'll shape the future in relation to what happens later in our lives and what happens in the lives of our children. More concretely, what that means is that the choice, the commitment, and it was a commitment, it was always controversial, but it was a commitment in this country. The commitment to initiate and uphold the institution of slavery, chattel slavery, and to have that institution of slavery be something that was defined by its use of people brought over without consent from Africa in order to serve as slaves. What that did, one, was mean that the life of the country and the nation and the society was going to be wrestling with how to reckon with that choice. And for those that recognize the moral wrongness of that choice, how to atone for it going forward. That was going to be something that was going to shape the entire country, not just African Americans, but everybody who lives in this country. And I'm sure we'll talk as we go into the conversation, but any of our listeners can recognize that the misrecognitions, the mistrust, the sense that you don't really recognize in the other person how their experience speaks to you, is rooted in part in our inability as an entire society and community to, properly understand, reckon with, and atone for that. For Black people specifically, what it means is that slavery, because it was a way of saying that someone enjoyed a superiority before the law,
Mm.
a superiority in the eyes of science, by some people's lights, and this is a very, very difficult thing to acknowledge, a superiority even before God. That meant then that there was a inclination both to define those people that were enslaved and then later formally enslaved, the descendants of slaves, as being inferior to other people within society. And that in turn meant that people would have less opportunities to seek economic enrichment, less opportunities to pursue and gain jobs, less opportunities to go to school, less opportunities to live in homes in various neighborhoods, less opportunities even to have friendships in relation to different people and enjoy fellowship, less opportunity to worship in common. I mean, there for a long time in the
Right.
United States, the old adage was the most segregated hour in the United States is Sunday at 10 or
Yeah.
11 o'clock, because that's when Black people go to their churches and white people go to their churches. But I think what it also has done that is much more positive, I suppose, but I don't want to have it be something that justifies
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
historical events that gave rise to it. What's been more positive is that the people who came out of this crucible of having been
Wow.
marked by this history are people who've been tested. They're people who've had to operate under pressure. They're people who've had to be nimble and adept and innovative at making more come out of less. And that heritage, whether you see it in cooking, whether you see it in writing, whether you see it in education, whether you see it in preaching, whether you see it
Right.
in the ways in which people compete on a sports field, there's a special genius that has come out of people reckoning with who they are as individuals and collectively as a people in the shadow of that history. And sometimes that shadow doesn't bring darkness, but it brings a certain kind of light.
A lot of people were worried about brokenness and adversity and pain and suffering. And actually, I've learned just with humans, we rarely do really well in success when things are great. We do most of our work in character and change is usually in adverse times. And, names like Nelson Mandela obviously come to mind in a very different context, but
Mm-hmm.
still,
Mm-hmm.
someone would think he wasted most of his life in prison, and yet we would say someone had to enter into the tension of truth and also some sort of adverse behavior that's going to make a change. Can you talk to us about that? Because it's not only in your family with Ernest, your father, but it's also something I think you research and study. There's got to be someone to step out.
I mean, two things come to mind that seem very important, and I know that they're crucial in my father's story in relation to Little Rock. They're crucial, I think, in relation to most stories of perseverance. The first part of this is that you don't do this alone, that
Mm,
you rest on not only the helping arms or helping hands of the people that nurture you and love you and find ways to affirm, what it is you're trying to do, and maybe even more importantly, who it is that you're trying to be. Like in my father's case, for instance, in terms of Little Rock, his sister, who was away at college at Hampton University in Virginia, his brother, his grandfather, his mother, neighbors, and perhaps most importantly, adults like Daisy Bates and others, and the other 8 members of Little Rock Nine. They had each other's back. And because they had each other's back, they could talk about all the things that made one feel alone and at risk of not succeeding, not realizing one's goals. They would remind my father, or my father would remind someone like Minnie Jean Brown or Jefferson Thomas or Carlotta Walls or Terrence Roberts, who they were as people, why they were valuable in that moment, why their goals, to finish high school in this case, and to be able to exemplify the righteousness of having made this change in the policy of their community, that this was something that was true to who they were as people. And, when I think about someone like Mandela, we think about Mandela being sent to prison after a trumped up court trial where he's accused of subversion against the apartheid state. And he stays there, I think, for close to 30 years. But one of the most powerful parts of that story is the fellowship that he enjoyed on Robben's Island with the fellow people that were imprisoned there. And they did things, some of them were spiritual, some of them were intellectual, some of them were in relation to debate and talking about strategy, some of them were about interpreting the news, some of them were about sharing stories of their children or their loved ones or their ancestry. But the fact that they enjoyed that fellowship in the face of diversity, and that fellowship allowed those people to remember who they were at their best, meant that what to the outside appeared to be a tremendous imposition, a deficit, it was prison, and there were tremendous kinds of hardships associated with it. But the human quality of that experience has to do with the quality of the human relations within that experience. If I were going to present one quality out of Black history that should be treasured as a national resource, it's this. It's this. Your genius, your profound value as a human being grows out of the ways in which you draw nurturance from the relations you have with other people and the capacity of other people to remind you of who you are and who you can be at your best. This is something that is a through line throughout all of African American history. And I can tell you so many different instances in which that made all the difference in terms of my father's experience and capacity to succeed under tremendous pressure, to get through a year of high school, graduate, and become the first African American to graduate from that high school and almost any high school that one would find that was not an all-Black high school within the South. I can trace that story back, as I just said, in Nelson Mandela's story, and know that when he was at perhaps his loneliest or at his most doubting in terms of whether or not he would get off that island, much less see change within the society that he had laid his life down for, in one sense, that the quality of the human relations that he had around him in prison was what was able to allow him to become and remain the expansive person who could be such an inspiring figure once he left those walls. But once he left those walls, he carried with him who he was as a person because of what he had encountered. And when we think, each of us, not just you and I, but everybody listening here, when we think about what happens when we're faced with challenge or adversity, particularly challenge or adversity that reinforces a social inequality. It could do with race, it could do with gender, it could do with faith, it could do with the ways in which education or class appears to close you in and assign you a place in society. Drawing on the ways in which people remind you of your capacity for excellence and your capacity for contribution and your capacity, most of all, for humanity, is something that always comes back and gives us the means to try to find ways to change the society so that other people will not have to go to a prison or have to experience discrimination or have to remember the story of racial violence or have to think about the story of abuse within a family in order to understand how strong they are. because
Wow.
they're not confronted by those problems, and they can simply go directly to their strength. Until we do that healing within society, though, until we correct the kinds of things that create those injustices, we have to rely upon what it is that reminds us of who we are at our best. And I think the first and foremost thing that reminds us of that is our relations.
I have a faith path in what I've researched, and I look at biblical history, and I would say the cycle of the judges, the ancient biblical history of there are people that loved God, but then their kids fell a little bit further away, further away, further away. They had to send a judge, get it right again. And I wonder if we keep relearning some of the same lessons about our identity, and do we find ourselves getting lost and maybe not replaying some of the same old tunes, but being reminded again of who we are, that humanity, we're to love other people, we're to empathize with others, we're to learn from our past. And it just seems like we almost change the names and the dates and the places, and we relive some of the things we just keep doing over and over and over again.
I think if you just start with the problem of people believing that that story is not my story,
Mm.
that that story doesn't touch me. I think this is one of the reasons why, maybe especially at this time in our history as a society and as a people, it's important to push that away and say any story that has value in affirming the humanity of anyone
Mm-hmm.
in a particularly powerful way is a story that all of us should learn.
Yeah.
And, I think your story that comes out of scripture and comes out of faith, that humankind is imperfect. It's prone to
Mm-hmm.
not being able to enjoy and meet the expectations of the grace that's given to it. That, people are provided opportunities and then they squander those opportunities. People are shown a way to think about a path that puts them in a place in which they can continue to achieve, a sense of spiritual well-being, and they lose their way in relation to thinking about those practices. That is something that's human. We're prone to sin. We're prone to backsliding. We're prone
Yeah.
to forgetting the lessons that we've learned. But then one of the ways, besides perhaps scripture, and perhaps even it's a reflection of scripture in one interpretation, to remind ourselves of that. I guess, the phrase that I understand is being able to see God in the person next
Yeah.
to you. And that involves believing that every story, even if it's not familiar to you, even if it's not a story that relates to your own experience, is a story that if you go into it and take it seriously, if you encourage a person to share their story with you, if you take seriously that their story is saying something not only about who they are and who they've been, but who you might be because of the benefit of learning the lessons that they've taken from that. And maybe we get to a point, we're never going to be perfect. We're
Right.
never going to not have some of that tendency to fall back from the place that we've been able to get to. But maybe our fall is a little shorter than it would have been otherwise. And maybe we have other people to help ourselves be picked up and regain our footing when we do experience that fall. It brings me back then to why we should be interested in Black history. Because Black history can remind people, including people who are not themselves Black, what does it mean to actually face adversity and come out on the other side of it remembering your humanity.
It triggers in me a couple things. First, my confession is I grew up in Los Angeles, and I would say even in the Rodney King riots that broke out in Los Angeles, I was aware. I was a young kid, but I'd always associated that with just angry Black people for some
Mm-hmm.
reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of those people that I wasn't aware of the history, a little bit of the history, but as we talked about earlier, even off of this time, probably a distorted history and not a full picture of history.
Mm-hmm.
And so never thought it was my issue. I had recently, the last couple of years, read a book that made me absolutely angry because it was blaming me and saying this is my issue. And then I think learning, okay, wait, I must not be aware, and I'm not empathizing with a story I need to know.
For too long, the abuses that some police officers exacted or enacted against African Americans that they encountered, really for no other reason other than that legacy of slavery that said that this person is less than me and I
Yeah.
can do what I want to them. And I need to show other people that I can do what I want to them in order to instill order within this community. That history goes back decades, that
Yeah.
history goes back generations. And when people protest against that, I think this is something that's hard to grasp at times because people see the news and they see the police and they have an idea of the police from their perspective, that they're there to protect and to help them. But people's experience, we know, as a result of everything that's happened over the past few years, but we could have known really as early as 1992, or for that matter, 1965,
Right.
when the Los Angeles riot that took place in that
That's
year
right.
was caused by an
Yeah.
incident of a traffic stop of an African American by a police officer. The memory of the ways in which the authority is actually operating in an abusive way. And there needs to be some capacity to compel that authority figure to sit before the public, sit before the community, or sit before the family, in the case of the story that you shared, in terms of your own family, and reckon with the ways in which their authority rested on abuse,
Yes.
and the ways in which their authority should be based on something more humane and more noble than that going forward. That's the history that one would have to have access to in order to understand something. And I say this with empathy and a sense of recognition. I can imagine that you, as someone in 1992 seeing this,
Mm-hmm.
did not have the benefit of that history.
So, Adam, if you could help us, because you've done so much in kind of giving us such a deep dive on some of the understanding of history, activism,
Mm-hmm.
what would you suggest are first steps for some listeners that they're going to sit face to face with some people in their rooms right now as they're looking at each other? Where do you go from here? What are maybe a couple words you could give to them to take some first steps in the awareness of history, and what do you do with that?
I think maybe the most powerful gesture of empathy is to listen as a person gains the confidence to share their full story with you. And that might not happen in an evening. That might not happen in an hour. That probably won't happen between you and I
Mm-hmm.
in the course of this interview, although I really appreciate your openness and I hope that I'm being open as
Mm-hmm.
well. But just committing to listening actively,
Yeah.
committing to listening in a way that says, I know this is not easy. I know you may not be entirely sure that you want to share this story with me. I want you to know that I want to hear it, and I will sit with you as long as it takes for you to share the story in a way that you believe is complete. And if we do those things in institutional settings where it's a little more risky to do that, because maybe it's a person who's in charge of a company
Right,
who's saying, I want to listen to your story. Or maybe it's me as a professor saying to a student, I want to listen to your story. Or maybe it's a police officer encountering someone on the street and saying, I want to listen to your story. If we do those kinds of things, both in our personal relations, but also in our public affairs, then we get somewhere towards building up the reservoir of confidence that we need in order to be able to recognize that we have to ultimately see all of these stories coming together as one story.
Dr. Green, so thankful for your time and just insight. And I want to point people in a direction just to learn more about you. I think you have so much more to offer, and just intrigued by that. How could they find out more about you or just get in touch with you if they needed to?
So, the best way I think to contact me is through my email in relation to my work at the university. That's apgreen, GREEN, at uchicago, one word, .edu. There are a bunch of other ventures that I'm involved in. I've been working with the city of Chicago in relation to its policy on monuments and memorials. That's a committee that can be looked up on the city's website, and I believe I will be up there at least for another few months, if not another year.
Mm.
There'll be work through the University of Chicago related to university community relations that can also be accessed, I believe, through the university's website. But I would say the main thing is please be in touch with me directly. I'm interested, again, not only in sharing what I've tried to share today, and thank you very much, Troy, for the opportunity to do that with you and those that are on this link, but also to listen,
Yeah.
because I understand better what's important in the things that I take of value from my relations, from my study of history, by knowing how it is that people themselves are thinking about this. And so I'm interested in hearing from those that you've brought together on this link. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks again, and you'll see the links in show notes.